being recorded.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the next in our series of show and tells for the Ofgem Strategic Innovation Fund Round 2 Discovery Phase projects. This morning, we'll be looking at cross-vector approaches for decarbonisation of transport. This has been a really important topic from the outset of the SIF, really. So you might remember that in Round 1 of the Strategic Innovation Fund, when we were focused on high-level strategic missions for the energy system, zero-emission transport was one of those challenges. In Round 2, transport fell within a number of different areas, but particularly one of the challenges, which was decarbonisation of major demands, where we were particularly looking at how do we decarbonise transport, heat, industry, but really looking at them quite holistically as well. Furthermore, for the Round 3 challenges, you might have seen that there's not explicitly a transport challenge, though it is still a high priority for the Strategic Innovation Fund. And really, one of the things we're trying to work on over the next year is how do we create greater alignment between both the transport industry and the energy sector as well. Because we've started to understand that a lot of heavy good transportation, for instance, fleets, some of the more difficult to decarbonise areas, such as communal transportation, public heavy goods vehicles as well as maritimes and ports. They are really looking for the availability of cheap, clean energy as a future fuel stock, but they don't necessarily know where the infrastructure is going to be available, what's going to be cheapest over a decade or multi-decades. At the same time, the energy sector is looking towards the transportation sector to say, which direction are you going in with your decarbonisation journey so that we can start planning and building the infrastructure that meets your needs. And as you can see, there's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario here. So over the next year or so, we'll be taking a concerted effort at looking how we can bring some of those strategies together, try and clear out some of the uncertainty and risk around some of those large strategic choices, and create some really groundbreaking transportation projects for Round 3 and beyond in the SIF. But having said all that, we've got some really interesting and ambitious projects within Round 2 that have just completed their discovery phase. As a quick reminder, these projects have all been working for about 2 or 3 months on their solutions and are just completing the discovery phase. They'll be sharing their findings with you today, and then they'll be looking forward to whether to apply to the alpha phase and start to scale up into prototyping and doing a detailed plan of a potential future demonstration. So if we could just skip on to the next slide, please. We've got 3 projects for you this morning. 2 of them are led by UK Power Networks. Park and Flex is looking at how public charging infrastructure can be deployed in a way which doesn't require significant reinforcement, and specifically looking at fast charging. We know that the availability of public infrastructure for charging is one of the things that people worry about when making the choice to transition to an EV. And hopefully some of these solutions can help reduce the need for that worry. We've then got integrated hydrogen transport hubs from Wales and West Utilities, which is not just looking at transport in isolation, it's also looking at how you can ground a local hydrogen economy in the construction of transportation hubs. So starting with some of the areas that are looking like they really will require hydrogen for system support or as a transport fuel, and then what are the spillover benefits that can be achieved because of that as well. Finally, we'll be going on to Lightspeed. That's another project from UK Power Networks looking at public charging infrastructure and supported looking at high speed charging. Sorry, Park and Flex is the one which is looking at how we can use car parks for supporting EV charging in local areas as well. So with no further ado, I'd like to hand over to the first project. That one's Park and Flex, which is supported by Baringa. So over to the team.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. I'm Miranda from Baringa and this is...
I am Steph Biedenberg.
And so it's been a really exciting SIF process. And we've spent the last 2 months with our project partners kind of working. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So we spent the last kind of 2 months working with our project partners from Master Energy, UK Power Networks and the GLA, kind of looking at how EVs could become an even more valuable resource in the future, serving as a flexibility opportunity. We believe that there are going to be around 33 million EVs that we expect to be on the road by around 2050. So this could serve as a huge opportunity. It's an area that hasn't had a huge amount of exploration to date, and our study is really focused on the potential and the value which could be accessed through V2G charging offering to deliver that flexibility and services whilst those EVs are plugged in at car parks already. So it's heavily customer focused. The reason that we've kind of looked at this part of the study is for us to reach our net zero goals, there's going to be a huge amount of renewable energy that needs to be integrated onto the network. And we believe that adopting EVs will also support that. So our study will kind of support that by supporting adoption through range anxiety and TCO concerns. We have revenue streams that will reduce that. And we think that we could deliver around 4.3 gigawatts of flexible capacity just in the UKPN area. Adding to that, the network operators are going to be facing huge constraints around the demand for connections that comes along with that. And this additional flexibility being served by around 500,000 bays could support the reduction in those costs. Additionally, the commercial stakeholders are what's going to make this proposition plausible, and we believe that there's going to be around 66 billion in value to be shared across that stakeholder chain. If I just move to the next slide. Just moving on, I think talking about our approach would support the innovation process, and so we prioritized the proposition through customer insights, particularly engaging with car park operators, the BPA and our hardware providers to see how we could get over some of those adoption barriers. We've used it to inform our customer behavior and attitudes around the assumptions that went into the model. And a lot of the business model preferences and the investment case constraints that we researched came from our car park insights. The second sort of thing that we went on to was the sizing of the available car parks. We quantified car park volumes and segmented those volumes based on customer specific behaviors like dwell time and customer value. And those are the things which really drive the flexibility capacity that would be available. We then prioritize those car park segments to the ones that would be most plausible and archetyped to them. The long and mid-stay settings are likely to deliver the highest value per customer, given the flexibility services that they can bid into over that time period. However, short stay car parks make up a pretty large proportion of the parking capacity. It's around 81%. And so it's not something that should be ignored, and we will assess those barriers moving into the alpha phase in more detail. We then kind of looked at route to market. So the technical V2G solutions and the costs around that, the roles and responsibilities within the ecosystem and how each of those parties play. And then mapping of the car park V2G business models, again, very much informed by our customer insights. From that, we kind of found that car parks were more inclined to low risk, higher reward models, all outlined in the report. We then use those in defining what our propositions could look like and what we'd like to test in future stages, and modeled that via our CBA. We defined the customer behavior assumptions, again, based on those insights that we discovered. We mapped those revenue streams that each archetype could bid into potentially, and then modeled the value that would be available on a per bay basis. That was then able to be scaled up to UKPN level, and then with further detail could potentially get some insight on the GB level. We did find that there were positive returns theoretically delivered by all car park archetypes, but again, very much dependent on customer behavior, which should be tested in the next phase.
Could we move on to the next slide, please? So hi everyone, I'm Steph, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how we actually evaluated this proposition. So as Miranda mentioned, sort of what we did is we took the idea that public car parks can provide flexibility. And it's all well and good saying, okay, Heathrow, huge car park, 40,000 spaces. In the future, 10,000 of those may be EV, V2G compatible car parks, and they can provide flexibility. But what we really wanted to understand was what this flexibility that they could provide meant in terms of how many gigawatts would it bring per car park, per area, and also what sort of returns are we looking at, both for the EV owner and for the car park operator, and how can you actually reach those returns? Is it through bidding into all types of flexibility services supporting the grid? Is it through a surcharge model where you're helping provide your customer with cheap charging in response for car parking? So we developed a model in order to sort of look at this. The first step was defining the archetypes. So as we all know, there are lots of different types of car parks available, especially across London. You've got your long stay airport type car parks where your cars are there for days at a time. Then you've got sort of short stay workplace car parks where people come and they park in the basement of a large office block, stay there for 10 hours and then leave in the evening. And then you've also got overnight car parks. So we're looking at sort of hotels and large residential office blocks here. And then in addition to that, we've got our public spaces and our shopping centres, etc. Now, what was really important about the definition of these archetypes is that each of those different car parks can bid into different value streams. So a long stay car park can effectively sort of act as a grid scale, as a large grid scale battery, providing lots of sort of steady flexibility to the grid. Whereas if you've got a daytime car park, it cannot do wholesale arbitrage in the same way, because if you drain the battery right in sort of the evening peak, that means that someone would come back to an empty battery. So we started looking at how we could take all of these customer focused propositions in combination with the different value streams to look at what you could make. Having defined these archetypes and also having defined the revenue potential available to them, Baringa have a lot of different price curves and price projections for many of these different revenue streams. So we were able to make a holistic model projecting out to 2070 of how these profits and these revenues would evolve as we go to the future, and how this would evolve as we get more V2G compatible cars joining the populace. Having done this evaluation, and scaled it across UKPN's area. So taking those different archetypes and assigning them through some VPA and some top-down, bottom-up assumptions about levels of car parks, we found that there were 2.4 million car park spaces in the UKPN area. Obviously, we're not assuming that all of these car park spaces can be used for V2G cars. So we did a sort of utilisation scale down as EV Park builds up. And we were able to show that, hopefully, scaling these benefits will achieve £1.3 billion of revenue in long stay settings by 2050, £2.1 billion in mid stay settings, and £3.2 billion in short stay settings, if achievable. Something worth noting is that the barriers to entry for short stay car parks are far higher than for the other archetypes. And this is something that we'd really like to dig into in more detail, because if achievable, that has a huge opportunity for grid value. Right at the start, Miranda introduced these propositions as providing key benefits across 3 different user categories: the DNO, society and net zero, and commercial stakeholders. So for the DNO, 4.3 gigawatts of flexibility is available, and this will help both integrate the increasing demand that's put on as we electrify transport, but also integrate the increasingly inflexible supply that we're bringing with renewables. For society and net zero, hopefully this will improve the investment case for V2G car parks, chargers and charge points, which will enable higher EV adoption, as there'll be sort of less need for range anxiety as you're sort of trying to go around. And in terms of commercial stakeholders, for EV owners, the total cost of ownership is reduced, and also there's additional revenue streams. Imagine going to the station and parking all day as you commute to work, and instead of paying £10 for your parking, you get paid for it. And then for car park owners, it incentivizes the increase in value that you can bring to your customers. As we mentioned before, this has a potential total value of 6.6 billion. However, this comes with a caveat. And if we move on to the next slide, this needs to be tested, and this is highly dependent on consumer behavior. Sorry, could we move on to the next slide, please? Thank you. This is highly dependent on consumer behavior and customer viability. As sort of David mentioned earlier, it's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario. And this is what we're proposing to test in the alpha phase of this trial. We want to see whether a demonstrator can prove that customers can and will engage in this sort of proposition. So uncertainty exists about whether stakeholders are going to engage. So what we're hoping to test, and we've come up with a number of propositions for this, is the customer incentives and behavior for each of these different archetype segments, how the different business models can work for the car park stakeholders and for everyone across that ecosystem, and also understanding what share of that value, so that £6.6 billion of value by 2050, which scales to around £28 billion of value by 2070, of that £28 billion, how is that going to be shared across each of those three stakeholders that we identified earlier and those three user experiences? So hopefully what we're looking at is an alpha and beta phase that would aim to demonstrate the extent that theoretical flexibility resource within car parks can be assessed in reality. Thank you. Any questions?
We can't see them.
Yeah, we've got a few coming in now, so I'll just run through them for you. So what evidence do you have that consumers would be willing to participate in flex services when using car parks? It feels intuitive that priority is to secure charge when using public infrastructure. Is this only applicable for long stay car parks? So I think that one came in fairly early in your presentation, and you might have touched on it a little bit, but could you comment maybe on how suitable you see this for short term versus long stay?
Absolutely. So something that's key to mention is that for all of our different modeling, we prioritize user experience and the ability of people to choose to get a full charge if that's what they wanted right at the start. So with all of the different propositions that we're offering, there is never a situation where someone will return to their car and have an empty battery. And the way we did that is we prioritize the different revenue streams across a day that people could access. So it sort of meant that if you're looking at wanting to return to your car with a full charge, you'll bid into some of the DC markets and short-term flex ancillary services with low load factors so that you can charge sort of alongside provision.
And in terms of testing the proposition, oh, sorry, go on. Would you like to speak first, Bren?
Oh, yeah, thanks, Miranda. Sorry, Ben Hall, another member of the team, but the silent partner for the presentation, to Q&A. I think the direct answer would be, we didn't look to gather and test direct consumer engagement in the discovery, so it's theoretical, just looking at existing studies to understand the extent to which consumers do engage with things like smart charging or other types of incentive schemes. I think one thing that surprised us in discovery, so to the point of, what we found that was unusual, was a key part of this was trying to get the insight of what the car parks are, how many there are, and what sort of things they serve. And whilst the long and the mid stay create a better return per bay, and then consequently a higher incentive for the customer, actually we found that short stay makes up 80% of the volume of car parks. And so the interesting question becomes, what would it take to be able to engage in the short stay setting, where the incentive for customer is going to be lower and it's going to be harder? So that's a key challenge. If we can overcome that and engage customers in a setting where they're just plugging in, maybe paying a little bit to sell energy in order to make a profit whilst they're there and then moving on, then it unlocks that 80% of the base. So I think the intuition is it will be easier to make a proposition and a higher incentive in the long and the mid stay settings. harder in short stay, but that's where 80% of the
It's a big
of the
opportunity. Yeah.
But it's important to say as well, though, that because of the size of the opportunity in long and mid, that makes up a larger proportion of that 6.6 billion, or at least half of it, even though it's only about 20% of the base.
Got it. I guess one of the challenges with these sorts of things as well is that consumer attitudes now might be different when people are used to operating with V2G and public charge points as well. And at the moment, you've still got relatively early adopters who are working with EVs, and attitudes might change quite a lot in 5-10 years. We've got a very simple question next from Andrew Stevenson. How will the energy be stored for use at car parks? So maybe just being clear about where the battery storage is sitting here.
So what
in the cars?
There we go. I think that's the shortest answer we've had to any question in the show and tell so far. So perhaps surprised with that one. Yeah, in the vehicles themselves. One from Rob Walden here. Interesting presentation and project. What proportion of cars did you model as being V2G ready / capable in 2030, 40, 50, etc.? Also, what assumptions did you make around people being willing to allow their car to be used by this, which is something we just touched on a little bit. Who'd like to take that?
I think we'll jointly take that. In terms of the numbers modelled, what we tried to do, so Baringa have a projection for EV percentage through and how it grows out to 2060. So we slightly used that internal demand model. But what we also did was calibrated that with the FES numbers. So in the FES 2022 scenario, they have projections for how many cars will be V2G compatible by 2035 and by 2050. So we used those numbers to sort of set the expected course of projection, because we thought it was good to align it with a large publicly available data set. Mm-hmm. In terms of expectations of people wanting to use it, what we sized the opportunity to, basically we looked at the size of the prize as part of this. What we were trying to do is work out what the opportunity was that existed. So I think we assumed around quite a high utilization. So for people who had a V2G compliant car who were engaging in destination charging, we sort of assumed that most people would be doing that whilst they were parked in, to see what could be achievable if we unlocked it.
And again, that's very much dependent on how well the incentives work and why we need to test that. And we've seen it in destination charging as well. A lot of these incentives that have been used to create that behavior of charging whilst you're doing something else and just utilizing your vehicle at that point of time. We've looked into those and considering using those, testing those in alpha phase. But yeah, again, it's very much subject to testing how willing and how much we can change customer behavior or utilize that customer behavior that's already in the market at the minute.
I think one thing to add is that the initial business case was more about the per bay basis. So trying to understand for an individual parking space, if you put in a charger, what do we think it could make? And we've got certain scalars in there of, you know, sometimes it will be used for charging rather than V2G, and sometimes it will be empty. Those kinds of things, but a lot of those are assumptions worked up with some stakeholders. The bit about then scaling it to the 6.6 billion is obviously then based on a whole load of uncertainty. So in a sense, the first bit about on a per bay basis, does it create an MPV and a payback on the charger? I think we've probably got more confidence in. And then obviously, you know, what it might look like in 2040 is the subject of more kind of conjecture and just scaling with certain scenarios. So yeah, there's a bunch of assumptions in there, but all of that is what would need to be tested more.
Yeah, thanks everyone. We've got quite a few more questions in, so I'm going to try and rattle through a couple of them, but we might need you to pick some up in the answering directly in the box as well. So got one from David Elam. Are there any technical barriers to using EV batteries as an energy asset? I thought some manufacturers wanted to protect their batteries in terms of charging and discharging. Are there any new standards needed to facilitate these propositions?
So quick answer to this is something that we'd be exploring more in the alpha phase. However, overall, we're only looking at the vehicles which are V2G compliant. at this point. So quite a lot of vehicles right now, it's absolutely correct, could not engage in this behavior. But what we're looking at is more of a cast to the future for the vehicles that can.
I think there's an element there as well. And obviously we've had to use existing insight to test certain assumptions. And so for questions like battery degradation, there's really good evidence emerging that if you stay within a 20% to 80% range on the cycles of the battery, then there's very limited depreciation to take into account.
Yeah, there's some interesting studies from Warwick University on that. I guess there's partially a nature of trust of who's actually charging and discharging my battery here then. Do I trust that they are acting within those safe limits?
But there are platforms that we've explored which can support that kind of like getting over that barrier and that fear for customers. Like Fermata's platform has really good insights and gives you a view on what your battery's doing at all times and maybe the impact of that. And so that really does support with the battery autonomy attitudes which are coming from EV drivers at the minute and those worries as a bridge to the next phase.
Great, we've probably got time for one more question. So have you evaluated the counterfactual sources of flexibility that V2G from public parking may have to compete with in future? Is public parking V2G, I presume, cost competitive, e.g. from thermal stores, heat networks, DSR, etc.?
The quick answer is that we have not evaluated that. What we've assumed is that our counterfactual is a world where there is no V2G from public car parks, and we're just sort of adding on another layer of flexibility within the system. So no, but interesting point to raise.
It's a great question. I'm not sure if anyone's got an answer yet as to, with all of these novel forms of flexibility that we're unleashing through the SIPs, actually is the market size big enough to use them all, and what happens to prices at that point? So I mean, certainly we've got information in our CVA that can talk about the cost, the cost to serve, but the question about what's the customer willingness to accept on the incentive and the size of profit for parties is one for a competitive market to figure out in future.
It's going to be a fascinating time, isn't it, when we transition from how can we capture flexibility into what's the best form of flexibility for any given period.
Just a quick thing to add on this. The fun thing about this proposition is that you don't have the upfront capex of the battery in the same way that you would for quite a lot of other large thermal stores, because that capex is sort of owned by each individual EV owner. Yeah. And you've got the charge point, but you're not paying for the same amount of thing. And your asset quality isn't degrading long term in the same way because you've sort of got the throughput of the different vehicles. So there are pros of this model compared to more traditional storage models.
It's very much about utilizing what we've already got rather than adding to the system.
Yeah, I guess a lot of people aren't making their vehicle choices on the basis of being able to provide flexibility when in a car park. They just like a certain model, and once they've got it, there's an opportunity to make a bit of money on it at the same time.
Exactly that. And I think there is a massive concern around the TCO, and if you can buffer that a little bit, I can't see why people wouldn't want to take it up too much, or why that would be a negative.
Brilliant. I've got one quick question. Maybe we can knock another one out before moving on to the next project. So Tim Thornton, who gets the reward when selling energy, e.g. for company cars?
Oh, tricky one.
Yeah.
We certainly didn't get into the sort of the company car question, but what we're looking at is, and we haven't worked the full P&L out and business models in this phase. We looked at business models that could work, because obviously you have a car park owner, you often have a landowner, or think of an airport. You have the airport itself, you have their car park provider, but then you have the charge point that's being financed. You have all of the control technology and layers within there, like the aggregator and market access, and then you have the consumer themselves. So all of those parties have costs to cover, and they're going to want to make margin. So the value that's created, the overall revenue, which of course is a combination of in some of these settings it might be avoided charging costs or a rebate on charging costs, but essentially we're looking at all of the value that could be created as a revenue, And then how does that split across the different parties? And is there enough to pay everyone back for their services and give them the margin that they'd look for? That's a subject for detailed design in the next phase. So but the point for Alpha would be working with some of these stakeholders that are already engaged to think, what's the specific business model that will work, for example, in an airport? How does that stack work? Is it a financially viable proposition, and what's the incentive we can give to the consumer? And then look to go and test that in the beta phase. But the company car angle is something we hadn't really thought of. So that's a thing to build into the thinking going forwards.
Yeah, plenty of interesting stuff to still investigate. So I'll be really fascinated to see how things progress on the project. But thank you all for joining this morning. If you could have a look in the Q&A box and answer some of the outstanding questions, that would be great. But I think we'll have to move on to the next project now.
Sorry, David, how do we access that?
And there's just a Q&A box on the bottom of Zoom. So if you have a look in there, you should, as a panelist, be able to type answer.
Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. We're running a little bit behind time, so I'll move straight on to the integrated hydrogen transport hubs. If I could hand over, is it you, Henry, and team?
It is, yeah. Brilliant, thanks, Dave. Good morning, everyone. So Henry James here, Wales and West Utilities, industrial cluster lead, but also covering some transport projects as well. And yeah, I'd be really thrilled to be involved in this discovery phase project. We deliver the project alongside Guidehouse, also RWE's technology provider, National Grid Electricity Distribution, and Pembrokeshire County Council. And I've got Tushar Biani on the call today, who's going to support in delivering some of the slides. Next slide, please. So in terms of agenda, we'll first run through background and problem statement, then go to the project outputs, so what we've learned from the project, and then next steps later on. Next 2 slides forward, please. Brilliant. So what is the problem? So essentially, we know that heat and transport are both inherently difficult sectors to decarbonize, both have their own challenges, and both have their own innovations that are taking place individually as separate entities. But what we want to look at in this project is how we could decarbonize both of those sectors and both of those energy streams in one project. And by doing that, we can hopefully lower the levelized cost of hydrogen through assessing that in a whole systems manner. Some of the issues with this is that heat produced during electrolysis is theoretically high enough, so actually an opportunity to support the decarbonisation of district heating, whereas otherwise typically wasted. So integrating essentially hydrogen production through electrolysis, using that waste heat in heat networks or for other sources of waste heat demand. This is then in anticipation of growing hydrogen transport demand and addresses both the need in an uncoordinated manner, could essentially waste investment, so could lead to inefficient investment in network infrastructure because heat and transport are being dealt with separately. So the solution that we came up with was hence the integrated hydrogen transport hubs concept, is that by taking an integrated approach to decarbonize heat and transport, that then provides an opportunity to improve network usage and ultimately lower system costs for the user and for the customer. What we want to do then is explore how co-locating electrolyzers at sites where both there is a need for heat and hydrogen and district heating, and specifically where hydrogen is being used to refuel heavy goods vehicles and buses. The innovations behind this and what we've looked at in Discovery is essentially utilizing excess heat and oxygen is not a business as usual case in these systems. Usually these are wasted revenue streams, and usually usually hydrogen is the principal source of revenue. So actually using excess heat and oxygen is what we looked at. And also assessing then the value of electrolyzer excess heat and oxygen hasn't been quantified at an industrial scale either. So it's been more of a small scale undertaking. Lastly, then, there are very few projects that have actually done this, and only a couple across Europe which have used waste heat but not oxygen at the same time. So how do we revenue stack those opportunities, both heat and oxygen, and use that to lower the levelized cost of hydrogen? A couple of changes that we've had through the discovery phase. So electricity curtailment became quite an issue for us in terms of understanding how we would factor that into the analysis, and also because of the limited data that we could get hold of. So it became quite a challenge to actually assess that in the whole systems archetype that we looked at, which we'll discuss shortly. So that's been moved forward into alpha, purely because of the limitation of data, but also the challenges of actually modeling that. Second, then, is oxygen utilization was put down as secondary importance, and that's because the value of that oxygen is highly dependent on what off-takers are essentially willing to pay for it. So you have different values, whether that's industrial oxygen or higher grade oxygen uses, such as in medicine and by hospitals. We go forward 2 slides, please. So how do we deliver the project? So we delivered it in five separate phases. First phase was to define the archetype concept. So what actually we were looking at, what's the high level battery limits of the system, and what would that look like when we start putting figures and plugging figures into it. That was defining the optimal configuration of the system, essentially taking all revenue streams into consideration and selecting the optimal electrolyzer capacity, electrical capacity, based on transport heating demand, as well as economic viability as well. So particularly with the view on beta and how we'd actually go and deploy that. We're not going to look at something which is perhaps 20 megawatts, because that's going to be unfeasible at this stage. We want something which is realistic and deployable. Second then was identifying suitable hub locations, and the main part of that exercise was to determine the criteria for identifying those hub locations and weighting assigned to each of the criteria. So some of the criteria we looked at was clearly heat demand, based on existing but also developing domestic heat networks, but also transport demand as well, so potential demand from HGVs and buses, and mapping that alongside critical road infrastructure as well, so mainly looking at motorways, intersections and areas like that. We identified 8 suitable hub locations across Wales and West through that decision matrix. Part 3 then was in stakeholder engagement. So we engaged with hydrogen hub and district heat network developers, and the aim of that was really to refine the archetype of concepts, and what we'll show on the next slide, and make sure that was aligned with developers and what they'd ideally look to see if you were to go through into deployment. Fourth section was looking at the regulatory policy and funding landscape. So how would we actually fund this sort of system, and also what the policy barriers which may stop us from doing that. And part of that is identifying suitable funding mechanisms applicable to the hub. That's quite challenging given the different revenue streams and the fact it takes in, obviously there's one input and there's multiple outputs. So there's different ways in which those can be funded. And lastly then was developing the business case, so bringing all that information together and identifying the 3 cost streams or 4 benefit streams for an integrated solution, but also quantifying net benefits of deploying the hubs right out to 2070. So how we're going to meet net zero in 2050, but also the longer term benefits for the 20 years that follow, estimated reduction in the cost of hydrogen, and determining the impact of gas price and carbon price sensitivities. Next slide, please. So what do we learn from the project? So the first thing is that the most optimal solution is essentially where excess heat is fully utilized. It can be quite valuable if deployed in the right way. And actually with the technology that we were looking at and the archetype concept, we selected a solution where in terms of alkaline electrolysis, which is preferred technology, and that's because of the high operating temperatures which that electrolysis process operates at, and therefore the waste heat which is available. Excuse me. And by selecting that technology, it's not only providing the necessary heat that can be utilized, so high temperature and high value heat. It's also quite deployable, as we know alkaline is perhaps the more advanced electrolysis technology which is available on the market. We also looked at modularity and design, multiple off-taker users. So actually, what are the key elements of this that you need to identify in order to move through into the next stage? So identifying those key elements, and that actually fed through into sort of additional partner requirements that we've identified for Alpha as well. So looking at that whole value chain of what the hub could look like, and those critical elements was really key in identifying where the barriers might be and where some of the challenges were. And what we settled on was a 3 megawatt electrolyzer capacity. Is actually potentially the most feasible in terms of deploying a system through beta. and deploying that across the network. And that 3 megawatt system just at a high level equates to around 800 to 1,000 houses in terms of district heating, which for us, I think when we started looking at the deployability of these and also the approximate size of district heating networks out there, both in development, also both developed and deployed, but also in development and in planning, that seemed like a very good fit for us in terms of marrying up that waste heat requirement with transport. And I think that 3 megawatt size is also quite applicable to sort of when you start looking at some of the local councils' needs for bus refueling and heavy goods vehicles. That's the sort of magnitude at which those parties are looking at in terms of transport as well. So it felt like a really good fit, and obviously based on the criteria came out as a preferred option. In terms of locations, then you can see on the bottom right there that the heat map that shows heat demand and heat supply across our region, and also on the right there where transport hotspots and heat networks have also mapped onto there. And it's quite clear to see that Bristol South, so we split Bristol up into sort of south and north of the M5, and that south location where the city centre is actually a really attractive option due to the number of district heating networks which are already present, but also some that we're aware of being in development as well. Sorry, could we? Yeah, thanks. Great, that's fine. I'm going to pass over to Tushar now, who's going to cover this slide. Thanks.
No, thanks, Henry, and morning all. So as Henry's mentioned, I think one of the key work streams that we looked at was really engaging with district heat and hydrogen hub developers. And that was really to understand and gain technical expertise on potentially existing projects that have been implemented or are being in the design process, as well as looking and understanding what the commercial aspect would look like for the project. So what we've done on the slide is really broken up the key findings in heat networks on the left and then hydrogen hub on the right. From a district heat perspective, I think the stakeholder engagers really helped provide clarity and insight in terms of how the overall system looks like, in terms of how you're able to capture heat, which will be through the main heat exchanger, then the energy center, which would have your backup boilers, and then the actual distribution network to residential or communal properties. It also really helps to identify what would be the demarcation point and the battery limit. So again, really understanding how the concept is going to be structured potentially, and then who will have the ownership and responsibility as we look forward in Alpha in terms of developing that. One of the other key aspects that district heat network developers helped identify and confirm is that the heat that is produced from electrolyzers can be utilized. So the UK is currently now implementing fourth generation district heat systems, and these are now operating at lower temperature. So it shows that the operating range for electrolyzers really fits in with the new district heat networks that are being deployed, and thus really providing technical viability. And really, I think one of the other key pieces of information that we were able to identify is understanding what the commercial pricing would be for using excess heat. Typically in district heat networks, these are benchmarks against the natural gas supply and then discounted to thus be providing a sort of competitive rate, essentially. And that was really valuable information that we could take into our business case. We did the same exercise for the hydrogen hub as well, and really looked at speaking to various stakeholders. One in particular was Statkraft, who were deploying a project in the Pembrokeshire area in southwest or South Wales. They again really provided us with a detailed understanding of the concept that they are deploying, which was really regarding central production station for hydrogen, and then having these mobile refuelers that are fueled at the central site, then sent to your refueling station that could be in a 50-mile radius. And that's where you have your hydrogen transport, such as buses or HVGs being filled. And then that refueling unit going back to your main hub site to be refueled. Again, speaking with Statkraft, one additional key piece of information that we identified was really understanding the funding mechanism. Previously, the project had looked at gaining funding through the renewable fuel transport obligations, which are essentially credits that you earn for producing hydrogen development fuel that's used in transport. But because of the immaturity of the market and the criteria that are needed to meet them, the hub and the developer actually switched their commercial model to the hydrogen business model that was released, as they as that de-risks the project for them. So again, really valuable piece of information. And then really lastly, we looked at other sort of technical parameters, one being the storage and on-site and identifying what that would be when it be deployed. And it was identified that it should be below 5 tons, which is based on COMA regs. Next slide, please. And I'll just hand it over back to Henry to step through this.
Thanks, Tushar. So very briefly, I'm just going to cover the barriers and opportunities for funding, but also some of the regulatory barriers that we have as well. So in terms of barriers on the left-hand side, one of the main things we identified through stakeholder engagement was essentially how the renewable transport fuel obligations, the RTFO, has highly strict requirements on additionality. So that is potentially essentially around proving where your source of electricity is coming from, and also marrying that on a time basis as well to how you're using that electricity source. And that could be really challenging for the hub concept, and also one which we're going to explore further in Alpha. But that strict requirement is potentially one which means that we'd have to look at other funding options to use for the hub. Other barriers are perhaps more obvious and practical ones, but control of major accident hazards, so COMA, which many people will be aware of, and trying to keep below the 5-ton storage limit on site to not breach into that lower tier COMA limit. Then there's also the GSMR aspects and approval required there from the HSE if blended or pure hydrogen is transported in hydrogen pipelines, which will be likely. In terms of opportunities then, so clearly there are numerous ways in which the hub could be funded. And one of the things we identified through this, so we have the Net Zero Hydrogen Fund as being one of those, Hydrogen Business Model, a Green Heat Network Fund. But particularly the hydrogen business model is that despite the fact that our criteria identified a 3 megawatt capacity as being viable for deployment, actually the hydrogen business model, as some people will be aware already, has a minimum production capacity of 5 megawatts, which means we may have to look at increasing capacity to meet the eligibility criteria of that model. And Green Heat Network Fund also had similar challenges in the sense that it's only applicable to England, so that rules out any deployment of the project in Wales using that fund. Next slide, please, and I'll hand back over to Tushar.
No, thank you. So really, I think with the piece of information in terms of understanding the Arctober concept, understanding the locations, we then really took all that information and built our business case and cost benefit analysis, which is summarized on this slide. So what we first calculated was really the cumulative benefits from the integrated hub. So these are really looking at what is the benefits associated with having the additional oxygen and excess heat stream. And this is what's been quantified on the curve. So in terms of the additional benefits that we've quantified, the first one is the additional revenue that's generated from selling excess heat and oxygen. The other benefit is the savings on the energy bill to consumers. So through the market engagement, we were able to identify the percentage reduction that excess heat would have compared to natural gas, and taking that and applying that throughout the period. And then lastly, understanding what the CO2 savings are from applying a district heat network or supplying oxygen that's generated from green electricity, for example. What does that equate to? So in terms of that's what's been quantified on the curve itself. What we can see is that the initial sort of beta project would be implemented first and completed by 2028. We would then really roll it out as a BAU across all the various networks until 2023 or 2033. And then really that is building up the cumulative benefits and reaching various milestones that we've annotated on the graph. In terms of the overall cumulative benefit that it would generate is approximately 71 million by 2070. So really showing that there is a positive business case behind implementing and developing this solution. One additional item that we've looked at was regarding the reinforcement costs on the gas network. These are costs that could be avoided on the gas network due to new users being added on, and thus the cost required on the network to maintain the supply for that particular user. When we actually started to look into this, what we identified is that we needed a lot more granular information, really in terms of understanding where the hub is being located, so that you can understand what the overall gas network system looks at that point to then quantify the reinforcement costs that are avoided. This is something that we'll be looking into the alpha phase, but we know that this could be potentially substantial compared to some of the other net benefits that we've already quantified. Next slide, please. And the one after. And I'll just pass it over to Henry to close on the next steps.
Thanks again, Tushar. So so next steps of how we deploy and develop this concept. Obviously, we've gone through discovery now and covered the work done in that. In Alpha, a few of the things we're going to look at. So firstly, engage with OEMs to evaluate the technology. So really nailing down into the detail of how we integrate the electrolyzer with the heat network and also downstream off-takers in terms of transport as well. And that will be done to sort of highlight battery limits, as I mentioned earlier, at an early stage to understand where ownership and operation sort of starts and stops, but also to highlight any barriers there and needs to address any issues through design. Then there's essentially detailed design solution for the beta phase. So going through that design process in terms of mechanical and electrical engineering, continue engagement with Hydrogen Hub and heat network developers, which will be key for this because we need somewhere, a location where this is deployable. So taking that criteria into account and then identifying priority and secondary sites for Hub with a proposed layout then on the back of Alpha. And really key to Alpha, which we've been looking at recently, is actually getting to the point where you've got a commercial model and contractual framework between all the parties. We're dealing with heat network developers here, we're dealing with transport off-takers, gas network, electricity network is going to be quite complex. So making sure you're in a position at the end of Alpha phase where you're ready to put pen to paper is going to be really critical. So I think that will be challenging, but I also think it will be hopefully successful in the sense of preparing us for beta later down the line. And obviously then they're selecting preferred funding route in terms of their Zero Hydrogen Fund business model, depending on the outputs of those earlier stages within beta. So Alpha, sorry. And then beta then will clearly go into the next phase of that, as we're aware, which later down the line, some of the items which are listed there. And really the benefit of this, which we all know through SIF, is the long-term rollout. So how can this be applied across the national scale, across the gas networks and electricity networks, and really give benefit to consumers through lower costs. Next slide, please. And this is just a bit of an overview of some of the work packages which we brought together as part of Alpha. So the work that's been identified to date that needs to be done. So obviously not going to go through this one by one, but just to give you a flavour of the work that will be undertaken. Next slide, please. That's us done. So happy to answer any questions and hopefully you find it useful.
Thanks both. Well, I think with this one particularly, what's really interesting is it starts to get to the nub of these multi-system interactions and really starting to tackle some of the difficult whole system problems that we might be experiencing through the energy transition. I would like to flag quickly to anyone attending that we've got ideation workshops for round 3 challenges, which are looking to bring consortia together to put proposals in. And one of those is on multi-energy systems, which is looking at cross-vector and different levels of the energy system operating together, which is obviously very applicable for this one. One of my colleagues will be popping a link in for anyone to express an interest in joining those workshops. We do have a few questions for this one before we move on to the next one. I've got one of my own, if I could start, in fact. So what exactly is the extent of the role in the gas networks for this? Could you give us an idea of sort of the distances that you might be using pipelines to transport over these? Are we talking quite a confined area? Just give us an idea of the scale of that.
Yeah, so I suppose that will depend on where we look to deploy the system. So there may be a need for a very short piece of network connecting electrolyzer to refueling station, or it may be something which is much longer. There may be a need to send a couple of kilometers down the road. I think that will come off the back of Alpha when we start looking at those particular locations. What we want to do in the first phase, I suppose, is just make sure that the concept stands up on its own. And actually, one of the things which I think is highlighted in your question, Dave, is that taking those additional potential costs as well of network infrastructure downstream of the hydrogen production could be really critical to this, and could mean that it's actually an additional selection criteria for locations that we need to factor in, because there will be a natural trade-off there between, you know, where you connect to the electricity network, or how you connect to the electricity network, and then also how close that point is to the point of hydrogen demand, and also the magnitude of heat utilization that you can draw upon. Because if there's high heat utilization, that might be a bigger draw to locate your electrolyzer next to a housing estate, or perhaps in an industrial unit, in which case the commercial trade-off then may mean that you need to run a larger piece of gas network downstream. So I think it is a wishy-washy answer, but in short, it'll come out in alpha and will depend on the location. Yeah,
I guess some of those locational requirements will be quite interesting, because presumably the hub itself with 3 megawatt electrolyzer is a reasonably substantial bit of kit, and in some cases for district heating you're likely to be looking at dense urban environments and things like that, where you might not have a lot of free land going around.
Absolutely. I think the key will be to tie in with those, identify an area where district heat is in planning, and looking to engage hopefully with a district heat provider for alpha. I think that's absolutely key for this project. But there'll be a trade-off there between how close you are to a district heat network, and also then being able to reach transport demand, because that may be, you could have a dense urban area which is suburban to a city, say Bristol, but actually there's limited access there for vehicles to refuel. So it might be there's a slightly disconnected system whereby the refueler is located, near a main junction, which is outside of the domestic housing estate, for the purposes of making it economically viable. Enter the gas network.
So I've got a couple of questions here. The first one from Andrew Benfield. I think this one's for me, actually. Aside from today, what other dissemination activities are planned for these activities? There'll be a lot of interest in the Hydrogen Hub project from policymakers and operators in Northern Ireland. Yeah, so we do have engagement mechanisms with policymakers and regulators who often act as sponsors of the projects, but we do internal briefings and seminars for Ofgem and DESNZ and other government departments. Take the point on Northern Ireland. It has been one that's been made before, and something which we probably need to move closer to front of mind. So we'll take that one away and look at how we can do some engagement with our Northern Irish friends as well. One from Andrew Stevenson. What is the hydrogen pressure that you plan to store the hydrogen at, and will it be a buried store using pipelines?
I'll pass it to Tushar in terms of the outlet pressure, and then I'll maybe jump on the back in terms of how we store it and whether it's underground or above ground.
Yeah, no, thanks, Henry. So I think the hydrogen pressure really depends on the operating pressure of the electrolyzer. And again, that's dependent on the technology that's selected. Typically, for example, alkaline or other systems, we were looking at around 20 to 30 bar gauge on operating pressure. And yeah, Henry, I'll pass it back to you for just the storage element.
Yeah, great. I mean, if it 20 to 30 bar gauge, that's not unfamiliar pressures for a gas network to be dealing with. So whether that is some sort of looped underground network for storage where you're utilizing almost line pack sort of methodology, or whether there's an above ground storage vessel, then that's open for consideration. I think the way in which these sites are going is that you have MCPs on site which are reliable and proven forms of storage. So depending, and that for 3 megawatts may be unviable. So you may need to look at something like a composite vessel, perhaps something new like that, or maybe traditional steel storage vessels above ground. But as I mentioned, COMA will play into that significantly. So trying to avoid that COMA regulation of that 5-ton limit before you reach into lower tier will be key, particularly as this system will be inherently located near to dense areas of population. So it's it's not conducive to breaching into that. We want to avoid it as much as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. Thanks a lot, both. We'll have to move on to the next project now because we are running a little bit behind. So if we can skip on and over to Jonathan's team to present Lightspeed.
Thank you. Yeah, welcome everyone. I'm Jonathan Gilmore, the project manager for Lightspeed for UK Power Networks. I'm also joined by Philip and Ben from Metaskis. Unfortunately, Brighton Hove Council members can't make it today, but they send their apologies. Yeah, let's go to the next slide, please. Cool. So today we're going to look at the problem, an overview of the project, what we did in discovery phase, the user needs, solution and findings, benefits, alpha phase, and then beta phase and beyond. So if we start with the problem on the next slide. Great, thank you. So yeah, the real problem here is actually around access to EV charging and increasing the uptake of electric vehicles. So as it says here, about 40% of UK households don't have off-street parking. And actually really to encourage the uptake, we're going to have to drastically relook at how we do on-street public charging. And there's definitely a few challenges that are hindering that at the moment, such as network capacity, local planning rules, and desire for less street furniture, the current lamppost charging situation, and actually cost as well. So it's definitely something which I think gets a bit of media attention as well. A couple of articles there, but it's something which is a key problem that we'll need to solve to help decarbonise transport. Next slide, please. Great, thank you. So yeah, the aim of this project is really to design and develop a bidirectional multifunctional DC converter to really completely transform how we do on-street public EV charging, and using the lamppost, whether that's retrofitting it or doing completely new lamppost, as a way to do that, to try and create, a smart vehicle-to-grid, vehicle-to-X charging network that actually anyone on the street can actually access. The real benefits is really trying to reduce, more street furniture, provide that flexibility, provide lower cost, and actually reduce more network infrastructure investment. But key, something like this, really what it should be able to do is actually enable more chargers on the street in a way that can provide flexibility. Yes, and then we'll move to the next slide, please. So we've got 4 partners for discovery phase, Metaskis, who are the real sort of technology innovators here, Brighton Hove City Council, who will be hosting the alpha and beta phase and are really actually where we look to deploy this. And we've got SPEN and UK Power Networks as well as 2 licensees. Next slide, please. Great, thank you. So the discovery phase was really actually a sort of technical feasibility study. And as you can see, there were sort of three main work packages that have a set order for why they're in that order. So we started off doing a lot of stakeholder engagement, whether that's DNOs, local authorities, charge point operators, to really understand the pain points and needs. Actually, what do people want from this, and actually how can we redesign how lamppost charging works, and then start to create some user stories and functional requirements that really then feed into those technical specifications as to, right, actually this is now what it could look like. Next slide, please. Great. So yeah, as said, a large part of the first month of April was a lot of stakeholder engagement. I think Philip and Ben can probably agree. There was a lot of conversations with a range of stakeholders, because actually it impacts a lot of different parties. So potential EV users, accessibility charities, local councils, across DNO, so DSO, asset management, connection teams, network operations, standards teams, charge point operators, energy suppliers, and flexibility aggregators. So yeah, you bet it. We spoke to pretty much everyone, and we then try to use that to gather those needs, those stories, to create these requirements, to then document, prioritize them, so that we can help to design something that is possible, that's realistic, but also ambitious. And if we're going to completely redesign how on-street EV charging does and how lamppost EV charging works, then we need to make sure we've thought about who's going to be impacted and actually how we can meet their needs. So I've put some of the 4 main ones, or some of the 4 main people that I think are, some of their needs. So from a council perspective, a lot of this was really led by Brighton Hove Council around, street furniture, existing lampposts, the feature of their lampposts, which ones actually they wouldn't be suitable for retrofitting for EV charging, actually, their ambitions around faster chargers, around lighting requirements, parking capacities, and really obviously actually decarbonising it and getting more chargers in. From a resident perspective, A lot of it is quite similar as well in terms of street furniture, trip hazards, lighting levels, street clutter. So actually making sure if we're going to do a mass rollout in beta and actually really deploy this across Brighton, it's got to be something that works for the residents, whether they're an EV user or not. And then EV users, some of these won't come as a surprise, but a lot of them have really helped to shape, the proposition and the design and what we'll do. But, price driven. So, I think we know this, but, the EV users, how can they benefit from smart charging and vehicle to grid or vehicle to X? Accessibility requirements. So we spoke to Motability, and actually that was really important to actually how can we design the charger, what it looks like, and then queuing and waiting, wanting to be in control. So actually, the last thing you want is, you're overnight, you've plugged your electric vehicle into a lamppost, and then in the morning you come and there's no charge in it. So actually being able to control what happens to their car and the charge levels is going to be really important, and that will really help drive the software requirements. Yep, and then from a DNO perspective, so here we're really looking at what's the art of possible, and where are there limitations, where are things that we need to fit into, and where are things that actually part of this part of Lightspeed, we can start to look at how best to do it. So we're looking at both unmetered and metered connections and the standards. So the unmetered would be retrofitting the existing lampposts, and the metered would be if we're doing completely new lampposts. And we look at whether it's the size of the cables, fuse rating requirements, earthing requirements, looped, other use on network, harmonic assessments. Actually, what are all the different considerations that we need to build into the design and specification so that we can come up with something that that can be rolled out. But some of these things are still to be answered in alpha. So, looking at how the number and size of the EV chargers, the export limits, some of these will still be looked out in alpha, and there'll be more sort of connection assessments and network planning once we know actually some of the short list of the sites. Next slide, please. So I'm going to hand over to Philip or Ben from Metaskis, who are really going to talk you through some of how our solution and findings evolved and the technical design of the solution.
Thank you, Jonathan. Hello, everyone. So for us, pre-discovery, we had the initial idea of actually designing a converter, that basically takes AC power, and at some point between the point of from the feeder pillar down to the charger, there's conversion to DC, so that we have the opportunities for us to either provide slow, fast, and potentially rapid charge. And also, because we have strong considerations for V2G and V2X, start to consider the opportunities of some form of energy storage, beyond the EV charger, so that we can start to look at local flexibility capabilities, as well as obviously having held energy just in case there's challenges with the grid in actually delivering capacity. And the approach behind considering energy storage for the reverse power flow, or the second part of the bidirectional power flow, was because we understand that there's huge demand in terms of huge interactions with this as it relates to pricing, and obviously embedding renewables into the solution. So the general approach was to get a multi-input, multi-output DC-DC converter installed on the network, either at a unit point or across multiple lampposts, where you have that single multi-winding capabilities, where you can have different interactions from multiple input sources, whether it's renewable, whether it's grid supply, whether it's energy storage, feeding into the car, and obviously multi-output, in the sense that when the power comes out of the EV and it's favorable in terms of price or emission-specific variables to basically discharge the car, we can start to look at outputs back into the grid or output into held storage. Now, the approach of this initial design actually changed quite a lot, because we saw multiple variabilities during the discovery. If you go to the next slide, where we started to see that, first of all, we have two scenarios where we can actually have an AC input and an AC-DC converter basically sat on the lamppost, whether it's a lamppost or a bollard, and we can start to push power either in a private connection, where we have the ability to basically draw power into an 11 kilovolts transformer, 11 kV transformer, to basically provide higher power capabilities down to these assets, to these charging assets, or the unmetered situation where we basically use the existing infrastructure with no changes to basically deliver whatever the DNO requirements are for basically outputting EV power on unmetered connections. The overall solution basically came out as the opportunities where we can have a mix and match of various solutions, where you can have an DC-DC converter on the lamppost, DC-DC converter on the edge of the network, whether it's a feeder pillar or the transformer, and potentially, like Jonathan said earlier, the capability for us to have a mix and match of both depending on scenarios. And there's obviously the opportunities for retrofit as well, where we know that it will operate in lower power, but we can definitely install those connections where there is not capability from the DNO to be able to deliver faster that private connection that's required. Next slide, please. The idea for us is whichever scenarios that we can design or develop, they actually have their strengths and weaknesses. And from the discovery phases, we realized that there is an opportunity for us to use the alpha phase to, one, design the converter, and then start to model the feasibilities of all three scenarios in metered, unmetered connections, and obviously potentially in new housing developments as well, where we can start to predefine how new housing infrastructure, new housing stock can already have existing capabilities for V2G built into them and for on-street charging as well. And we also hope that this final design would obviously combine the abilities for us to start to introduce local neighborhood energy generation, whether it's from solar panels on the lamppost or potentially drawing power from home-based solar solution to basically create that last mile layer capabilities for access for V2G, and obviously introducing renewables at local level for charge. What is also very critical about this model is the fact that we understand that we can start to create multiple layers of communication path, you know, that basically secures the network even further. Next slide, please. Jonathan, over to you.
No, thank you, Philip. And yeah, I guess just to add to Philip, I think, you know, one of the key bits when we started discovery was actually, you know, what can we do? What can't we do? Is this feasible? You know, are we going to, you know, is it going to give the benefits that we want? But actually through the discovery and through the designs and conversations with Brighton, with UK Power Networks and SPEN, actually, I think it's been a really successful discovery phase that shows there's a clear pathway forward that we can do. And as Philip said, actually, there's almost a couple of different scenarios as well. So a lot of different options. Assessment of benefits. So I think there's three main benefits: cost to consumer, network avoided costs, and greenhouse gas emissions. As we've mentioned, and as we've had in, you know, a couple of the other show and tells, is that, you know, the vehicle to grid, vehicle to X lamppost chargers will enable the smart and flexible charging, both, you know, whether that's services to grid, but actually also just between the lampposts and actually for the consumer as well, which hopefully will enable reductions in the price of charging for customers' EV. Also, across Brighton, we know there's, you know, network reinforcement across LV substations will be required. Actually, if this is deployed in the way that we hope, actually that will be able to reduce some of that need for network reinforcement by providing flexibility services to the grid. And greenhouse gas emissions. So really, it's, you know, based on that premise that actually Lightspeed is going to help increase the uptake of EVs from diesel and petrol by really giving those residents without off-street parking access to on-street EV charging. So yeah, if we go to the next slide, please. Alpha phase, I know we're short with time, so I'll try and go through this very quickly. But what we're now looking to do is actually, you know, design this prototype. So Taskis will be actually building and testing a prototype charger, whether that's the hardware, software, and an energy management system. We'll then, with Brighton, actually be shortlisting some sites and engaging with residents, with disabled car user advisory groups, to actually find, you know, willing tenants to participate in beta. And then we'll have a rollout plan looking more in detail at the route to market, testing plan, commercials, manufacturing, installing relationships, you know, actually, how are we going to put this in the ground? Network planning. So once we've got those shortlisted sites, actually now we can do a bit more in-depth assessment on those streets. And then we'll be having EV Energy on board as well for flexibility and customer interface, who are really going to help us actually understand better the behavior, flexibility, user interface, proposition development as well. So we've got the last slide, I think, which I'll hand back over to Philip.
Yes, thank you. I think one of the critical things that we also want to we will be achieving in the alpha phase is to understand what that design looks like, you know, and the priority would be the most minimal approach that we have to have network reinforced, because that's very critical. We from the discovery, we found out that there's a lot of opportunities for existing infrastructure artists to basically deliver some of these capabilities. And the idea would be, as part of the site selection, start to see where those opportunities are, where there is 11 kVA access, 3 kVA access, whether it's shorter network, so that there's not a lot of investment and we can start to prove added value. And then obviously build that into a proposition where you can see return on investment on existing infrastructure, minimal investment in network reinforcement, and then start to build that case, you know, to increase capacity. And the idea is that would lead, that part of the alpha would lead us, and the development of the hardware software elements will lead us into a rapid potentials for rapid scaled rollout in beta, where we can actually have more than 500 bi-directional chargers around Brighton, and potentials to also explore similar on Spence network in Scotland. And obviously look at how we can start to use flexibility as a mode to incentivize EV adoption, get more charge points on the streets, and increase the benefits to users in terms of price, in terms of emission, benefit to operators, CPOs and aggregators in terms of what the potential markets look like. And one of the key things that we will be achieving, hopefully as part of the alpha phase, is not just designing one converter that does slow charging or fast charging or rapid charging, but start to look at the band in terms of the capabilities of converters to basically do fast and slow, you know, or slow to fast, and obviously bi-directional capabilities of discharging as well. And the idea is to obviously see how well we can put that to existing regulators work and working with Ofgem in terms of what standardization opportunities look like. And beyond that is obviously try as much as possible to look at business model to scale this across the country and potentially grow strong business out of this. Thank you.
Brilliant. I think that's all if we can skip on. Thank you both for another fascinating presentation. I've really enjoyed the set of them this morning. I do have a couple of questions myself. One of them is, have you considered longer term modeling to see if the solutions, rather than avoiding reinforcement, just kick it down the road a little bit, and whether that in the end you might have a higher quantum of cost than if you were to just do the reinforcement up front? Is that part of your thinking?
That's a very good question, actually. The idea for us was, we understand that the overall cost to basically technology adoption, we're basically in the valley of death as a country and as an institution that's looking at introducing this new innovation, V2G, V2X. And for us, we believe the initial approach is the lower hanging fruit, where these opportunities actually exist, you know, where there's minimum reinforcement that needs to be done. So whether it's an existing lamppost that we can retrofit, you know, to deliver slow charge, and we can deliver that capabilities, or where there's an access to a 33 kVA line that can be dropped down to 11 kVA line, and you run shorter connections in an estate. We believe that that's less expensive, you know, and there's lower capital investment that's required from technology innovators like ourselves, or CPOs, or the DNOs. And that way we can use that to build an is it profitable or it's not profitable model out of it from an investment point of view, and gradually use that to validate further investment. I know the general school of thinking is, yes, it has to be done, there is a need, but we almost have to think about a method where we show benefit first, you know, and that generally in business encourages or incentivizes further investment.
I just wanted to add as well that, you know, I think in terms of the rollout plan and how we deploy it, yeah, we won't, it's not like, I think Philip said, but the areas where I think network reinforcement's going to will be happening everywhere. You know, actually, it's not something which, you know, actually as there's, you know, 100,000 vehicles, diesel vehicles in Brighton, actually for those to become 100,000 electric vehicles, you know, there's going to be a lot of LV substations. I can't remember the figure. I think it's a couple of hundred LV substations that are going to need upgrading. So actually, we won't be targeting areas that need network reinforcement. We just know that there will be network reinforcement across Brighton, across lots of towns and cities.
So you're almost offsetting the extent of reinforcement needed, not just avoiding it. Yeah, it's a fair answer. We've just had one question come in from Tim Thornton. How are you going to make it clear to the drivers the different capabilities of the post?
Yeah, good question. This one came up actually in the engagement with Brighton around signage, and that there isn't Department for Transport signage around it. So yeah, it's definitely something we're going to explore around, you know, the parking lines signage in alpha phase, and I think that's probably something which applies to all of these projects actually. So yeah, it's definitely something I think we collectively probably need to look at.
One of the interesting questions that doesn't immediately spring to mind unless you're deep in this. Did you want to add something, Philip, before we move on?
Yeah, I wanted to basically say that's very critical, and it goes alongside the same thinking that we have for accessibility in the alpha phase. We see accessibility as something that's very critical. You know, we don't want to create trip hazards because it's on lamppost. So options like bollards becomes an example. You know, we don't want to discriminate, you know, and create opportunities where people living with disabilities cannot use these assets, you know. So it's around, the alpha phase is around focusing on, you know, all of these things, including what the hardware looks like, you know, and seeing how well we can deliver a solution, or at least start to think of ways where we can deliver a solution that actually works for everyone. We're not saying we're going to solve all of the problems, but it's about being very conscious in targeting situations like this and issues like this, and making sure that we're looking to cover them ahead of time.
And it's something that I really like about your project, honestly, is having the technology provider in the project from the outset. You can see how actually the system requirements can help to inform the development of a technology and vice versa, rather than specifying what we need and what's on the market at the moment and ending up in a situation where something doesn't quite fit the full requirements of its users and the network, of course. Brilliant. We'll leave it there then. Thank you very much for your presentation again. We've got a couple more slides just to run over what else we've got coming up. We've got 3 more show and tell sessions to finish off next week. The first one on supporting a just energy transition, Monday afternoon. The second one on transitioning local energy systems on Tuesday. And then we'll be rounding up the Discovery Round 2 series with the supporting robust deliverability of net zero, which looks at all the just energy transition and equitable questions. If we could skip on to the next slide. We do also have a series of webinars for anyone who's thinking, I would like to get involved in some of these projects, but I need to understand the energy network landscape and the role of the energy networks a little bit better. We've put together a webinar series, which is an introduction to the various different types of energy networks, their roles and responsibilities. Then moving on to the policy and regulatory environment, what are the responsibilities that they have to carry out, and how can we influence policy and regulation through the CIF, before moving on to market access and commercialization and innovation support and funding. So this is a series of webinars to really help people who are at a relatively early stage of engagement with this to move along the journey to be in a position to be very well positioned to deliver some projects in future. If we could skip on to the next slide. As we always remind you, there's many ways to keep in touch with the Strategic Innovation Fund. One is on the Ofgem website. Probably the most important is to sign up for our newsletter, which will keep you informed about opportunities on a monthly basis. We will also have some new podcasts on our Bright Spark podcast for the round 3 challenges coming up soon. And of course, we always have the YouTube channel, which will have all the 60-second videos, but also the show and tells published on them shortly as well. All of this will be shared in the chat, and the slides will also be shared. If we could just skip on to the final slide. thank you all for attending. Not a bad way to spend a Friday morning, getting to learn some really fascinating aspects of energy systems innovation. Hope you have a really good afternoon and a good weekend as well.